Hey everyone, Pastor Caleb here, answering some more questions from our Question and Answer Sunday. We're going to do some question and answers this week rather than our normal daily devotions, just so we can catch up on all the great things that you and other Christians asked about for our Question and Answer Sunday. So the question that we're taking on today is, I'll make sure to get it up here. Should I be friends with someone who has values that don't align with mine? This is a great question. Obviously, with making friendships in the world, it's sometimes tough as a Christian because you have a certain set of values that very often go contrary to what the rest of the world believes, what the rest of the world does, what the rest of the world values. And so we have these two things in tension, right? And I think this is what the question is getting at. Like on the one hand, God has called the body of believers to be in unity and to be together, to be building one another up, following all the one another passages of the scripture, and to hold on to true doctrine and true teaching as that body of believers, not allowing false teaching or any sort of blasphemy of God to exist in its midst. And then on the other hand, you have the call to evangelize, to preach the gospel to all nations, and to bring people into your life who need to hear that gospel. And very often we find the best way to do this is to create relationships with them. It's one of the things that we emphasize in our church. In fact, we say that our steps are learn, live, lead, right? And so you're learning from the scriptures, living together in community with your life group, and then you bring people into that life group so that they can see the community of believers and be loved by that community of believers in order to give them a chance to bring them to a lead event, which is where we interact with the gospel for them at their level, questions they are asking so that they can know Jesus. So you have these two things in tension. What are you supposed to do? Well, I think what we often do as North Americans is we try to take this question and make it super black and white. Like on the one hand, we'll say, you know what, just everything that is the world, keep it away. And we'll try to justify this with like Jesus' words where he says, they are in the world, but they are not of the world. That requires a little bit of nuance, but that's the kind of verse that people will go to. And on the other hand, people will say, we have to be in the world. How else are we going to interact with the world and understand it in order to preach the gospel to it? And I would say on that, and that opinion, there's really no scriptural backing for that. The Bible does not say to make relationships with people in order to share the gospel. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but let's be careful about saying the Bible tells us to do this when the Bible doesn't actually really tell us to do this. The closest we'll get is like a Luke 16 section where the Bible will talk about using our wealth in order to create friendships, and that word friendship is a little bit squishy too, but to create some sort of interaction, acquaintance, value in a relationship that allows me the opportunity to share the gospel. In other words, I'm leveraging the relationship for the sake of the gospel. So again, you have to be very careful about what you say the Bible says and what it doesn't say. So with all that in kind of the purview here for this question, let's look at some relevant scriptures. Let's first of all start by going after the opinion that we should keep the world at a distance, that we should, not interact with people in the world in a personal way. We shouldn't bring them into our lives. Let's first remember what Jesus did for us. Okay, so the section I want to go to first is Romans 5, and I'll just be reading off my computer screen right here. But Romans 5, starting at verse 8, it says, God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved by his life? So a couple of things I want you to pick out of that verse, and that's how God talks about us in his plan of salvation. So verse 5 talks about us as sinners when Christ died for us, and verse 10 talks about us as God's enemies when he died for us. So let's understand that God actually was willing to associate with us even though our values didn't fit his values. Okay, so the message of the gospel is that I am willing to give up of myself for you even though you may not actually share the same values as me. So as we think about people who don't believe the same thing as we do, or don't live the same way as we do, don't value the same things as we do, let's remember that that is literally exactly what God does. He looks at us and says, their values are not my values, but I'm still going to die for them. This really throws out the idea that you can just say, well, that person, they're kind of like the way we kind of talk about it as well, but like they're toxic for me or something like this. And so I'm not going to keep them around. Well, don't be so quick to do that. Literally, you are toxic to God. In fact, he would actually send you to hell if it were not for the death of Jesus on the cross. So don't let that be the reason that you don't associate with somebody. Okay. In fact, what we're called to do is associate with those people for the sake of bringing them the gospel, for bringing them the one who died for them while they are still sinners. Okay, here's another verse to think about. This is Hebrews chapter 2, verse 11, it says, both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family, so Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. So this verse teaches us that before we were sanctified, before we were justified, before we were brought into God's family, there was some reason for Christ to be ashamed of us. But now, because he has brought us into the family of God through our baptism, put God's name on us and made us brothers and sisters of him and sons and daughters of the Father, therefore now God is no longer ashamed to call us his brothers and sisters, right? So if you think about this again in your relational context, okay, there's a level of relationship that Jesus is not willing to say he has with you unless you are actually baptized into his family. He calls that level like brothers and sisters. Now that phrase, brothers and sisters, gets used in the church a lot to talk about those who believe the same thing, right? When the apostles write to the churches, they say brothers. When we greet each other, we talk about ourselves as brothers and sisters in our church, right? And so maybe what I would say is the application of this verse is that there is a type of relationship that you cannot have with another person unless they are also a believer with you. And by being a believer with you and believing the same thing about the scriptures that you have, they are going to have access to that relationship, that deepest level of who you are, because fundamentally, being a Christian means you are a believer in God for the salvation of your sins above all other things that you are, before you are female, or before you are an employee, or before you are a parent, or before you are a citizen, before you are anything, you are fundamentally a Christian. And if you have that deepest level shared with somebody, then you have a special type of relationship with them. Remember, all relationships are based on commonalities, right? But if we have that greatest commonality, that can bring a deep level of connection between people who otherwise would not interact with each other. I think about this particularly in our congregation. We have people who, based on either socioeconomic status or job or gender or race or anything, like would be generally not associating with each other. But in the church, they are, because they have something deeper than that. And so what I would say is, on the one hand, it's not okay to say I'm not going to associate with those people. But it is also not okay to say I'm going to bring those unbelievers or those people who don't believe the same thing I do about Jesus, even if they are Christians, so close as to be like my brothers and sisters. That is a place specifically reserved for the people who believe the same thing I do. And in fact, the Apostle Paul goes a step farther with this. And this is from 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And this is verse 14. He says, "Do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness?" So in here he says, your connection in the sense of yoking together. So think of a yoke, like we don't really think about this because we're not very much of an agrarian society, but a yoke is a piece of wood with like metal hoops in it that connect two oxen together. And those two oxen are walking together, working on the same task in unison. So if you think about your life that way, in what things are you yoked with other people? Well, if you're married, you're yoked together with your spouse, right? You are working for the same goal together. If you are working at a job, you are yoked together with the fellow employees that you have. Now, you're yoked in a different way, right? Like my responsibilities and the amount of influence I have on my coworkers is different than the amount of accountability, responsibility, and influence I have on my spouse. So it's a different type of yoking. And the type of yoking that Paul is talking about here is in the context of what you believe. He says, if you don't believe the same thing as somebody, do not put yourself in a life position that yokes you together with them in regards to what you believe. Okay, so when we think about values, if we're just talking about what my worldview is, like how I see the world, am I yoking myself together? Am I bringing myself close with? Am I connecting my life with people who are going to build up my faith or not build up my faith? Paul says if they are not going to build up your faith because they do not believe in the righteousness that comes by faith through Jesus, then you should not be connected to them. Now, people will say, okay, well, that means that then therefore I can't be friends with people who aren't believers. I didn't say that. See, the problem that we have as English speakers is we have this like squishy word friend, and we stretch that word to mean all sorts of different things. Like my wife is my friend, and I also have friends from high school that I haven't seen since I was 18. Like we use that same word to describe those two very different relationships. Unfortunately, because we have this squishy word, we don't usually draw lines and say like, okay, these are the people that I actually count on for my day in, day out sanity, my, counsel, these sorts of things. We have the word best friend, but even that, like, what does that even mean anymore? So what Paul is saying is if you're going to let a person into your life in such a way that they have the authority to speak truth into your life, call you out for sin, bring you Jesus, be one that you depend on for your emotional stability and your connection to Jesus, that person must be a believer. Do not bring a person who's not a believer into that relationship. So that to some extent means when you have relationships with unbelievers, keep them a little bit at a distance. Doesn't mean you have to be cold. It doesn't mean you have to be a jerk. You should be friendly. But you also ought to not let them become so close to you that they have an influence on your faith, on what you believe about the world, about how the world works. And the reason is not because we hate these people or we think that they're stupid or anything like that, but because we know Satan is constantly trying to tempt us to be not believers. And he's going to use anything he can get to get us out of the faith. And that might be the influence of a close friend. Now, all of that said, what do we do when we have, look at people and we're like, well, they don't share my values? We first of all have to define the word values, okay? So like if your values are like, let's pick something. I don't watch TV. That's a value. Can you be friends with people who don't watch TV? I think you have to decide for yourself how much that value actually means to you, because that's not a biblical value, right? So if that's a person that you're going to say, I don't want to associate with them because they don't watch TV, I'd say that's kind of a dumb thing. Like, why would you not associate with that person when the Bible doesn't say that's something you shouldn't associate over? Like maybe that person really needs you and you have the opportunity because you know them to be that influence in their life. What if the value is, I value that my children go to church every Sunday? Well, if you have a family who doesn't bring their children to church every Sunday, maybe it's not a good idea to have your kids become close friends with their kids. That's hard. I know it's hard to find friends when you're a parent, but like their faith is more important than their friends. And so maybe that's a value where you're going to say, well, the Bible tells me I have to do this, so I'm not going to connect my kids or my family to anybody who isn't going to do that, at least in a way where we depend on each other and we look to each other for friendship. So you have to define the word values. You also have to define the word friends. Is friend in the sense of like the guys that I play hockey with, for example. I like those guys. I enjoy their company. I don't depend on them for any of my emotional stability, except for two of the guys on our team who are members of our church. I do depend on those guys for my emotional stability. But the rest of the guys, like I'm friendly with them. I'd have a beer with them. I'd talk hockey or talk whatever, politics, I don't know, just whatever we needed to talk about. But I wouldn't depend on them for what's going on in my life or to call me to Jesus. So define friends, define values. And then remember that the two extremes of we never associate with people who are not believers and we only associate with people who are not believers. We try to put our children or our families in positions to associate mostly with unbelievers. Those are both not true. That God calls us to value the family of believers, to put our primary energy and relationships into the family of believers, and then use that as a springboard, a solid foundation that we could always fall back on if other relationships don't go well, to spring into relationships with non-believers so that we can spread the gospel. So I know that's a long answer, and I hope it was helpful, and I'm appreciating the question. If you have questions, you can always ask questions on our website, crossoflife.net. Under the Start Here tab, you'll find Ask Our Pastor, and you can ask a question there. Thanks for this question, and I look forward to answering another one tomorrow.